The Chronicles of Royal High, The Lost Noble. The cloaked figure passed across the far-reaching spans of the decrepit stone courtyard. Pillars that might have previously stood proud and strong now laid ruinous and desolate all around. Perhaps a court was once held here, but it was evident a place such as this had not seen civilized customs for more than a millennia. The charred castle above him, high on the conical mountain, was the only remaining evidence of life before the darkness came. Before him, a pair of foreboding iron doors were built into a facet of the cold obsidian mountain. Open, his ominous voice commanded to the creatures who guarded the threshold. The hulking Desdom guards, golem creatures made of ashen rock and scales, stepped aside and unbolted the massive iron locks, opening the doorway. The dark figure stepped into the forgotten stairwell as distant lightning crackled from the churning charcoal clouds in the heavens behind him. Without delay, he descended the spiraling stone steps as the golem guards rumbled the door shut, sealing the way behind. Far-off screams, waves of terror and anguish, echoed throughout the darkness of the passage. Mounted torches, scarce in placement, held precious flames that licked and danced upon the walls as he swept impatiently through the winding labyrinth of stairs and corridors. Mumbled strings of spiteful curses from a forgotten language fell from his lips. The clicking of his frantic footfalls reverberated off the stones. Rage radiated from his very existence, the intensity creating a horrible atmosphere of its own. Farther into the decaying maze he delved, the ever-growing echoes of anguish spurring him on. His heavy cloak melted and swayed with the darkness that surrounded him, swathing and forming around his every move, hiding his face from the cast of the meager torchlights, as if he were one with the void. Voices whispered and babbled in the dark with mouths unseen. The menacing presence of their master's anger unsettled their tortured souls. Another haunting wail of agony beckoned, closer now, seeming to mock him, with every corner turned, every deeper, darker hall passed. At last, he came upon a lone brazier at the entrance of a lengthy stretch of tunnel. Without pause, he whisked down into the final corridor, malice burning up his chest. All that was standing between him and his prisoner was a stoic iron door at the end, guarded by 4 more towering guards. Open, the Dark One's aphotic voice ordered them over the bedlam of suffering. The thickly armored golems of Desdom stepped aside, unbolted the heavy iron locks, and swung the intimidating door free. At once, the full strength of the agonizing screams flooded the Dark One's senses as he passed into the dungeon. Chains rattled and creaked in the darkness, while the disturbed shadows flared in the restless tongue that was foreign to the living. "Silence!" the Dark One commanded fiercely. The cries did not relent from the deepest part of the room. "I said silence, whelp!" he bellowed, swiftly striding the remaining length of the grotto to backhand the prisoner in the face. "I can't!" the tortured captive cried out once more, his legs and arms bound to the corners of a wooden contraption. "Enough!" The Dark One's wicked voice cracked as he raised his hand, letting the torturers know to relent. His minions, craven and gnarled beings with clammy skin and scales the color of soot, abated ever so slightly. The prisoner labored for breath, the desperate sound filling the stark silence. The Dark One stalked around the vast cavern, his cloak of shadows trailing behind him. They were illuminated only by the dim light of a few sconce torches anchored upon the endlessly climbing walls. In the high ceiling, a thin crack allowed the elements in, and the moon streamed through a few slim beams. The sparse light revealed horrific things throughout the prison. Against the wall, An iron maiden waited to devour. Across from this, a wooden board, littered with nails and beset with leather straps, promised cruelty. Farther into the gloom loomed a crank and cogs contraption, its metal gears grinding away. Suspended freely on chains from the ceiling to the walls swung a wrought iron cage. Weathered scythes, barbaric clubs, and rusted utensils of all sorts of grisly natures hung down alongside it, dried blood staining them all. The Dark One paused thoughtfully before slowly moving towards his captive again. "Do you know where you are?" His aphotic tone softened, settling into a smoother, more human cadence. "I don't," the prisoner stuttered, still gasping for air, for words. "Do you know who I am?" "No." "How disappointing," the Dark One tutted, feigning offense. "We were once so close, in spirit and brotherhood, and you have forgotten me already," he belittled. The captive barely managed to whisper, "Who are you?" The Dark One smiled to himself. After all these years, he had finally won. He would finally taste his revenge. "I do not think you understand the gravity of the situation here. So let me clarify," he snapped. "I ask the questions, and whatever I want to know, you are going to divulge." His demand roared through the cavern. The phantom whispers flared in response, magnifying his malice. "And right now, I want to know who Sealgar is." "Who?" the prisoner choked out. "Liar!" the Dark One exploded. The torturers tightened their hold on the captive to emphasize their master's threat. "I really don't know who that is," the poor soul stammered, excruciating pain threatening to steal his voice. The Dark One took several steps back, appearing to search for words in a calculated moment. "Okay, we'll try this." He cleared his throat before beginning again, attempting to quiet the rage that still boiled within. "Where is the Astrolore staff?" "Astrolore?" the prisoner asked, bewildered by the request. "It was lost. You can't wield it." The prisoner choked out, dread knotting his stomach, knowing the dreadful cost of such an artifact. The Dark One shot across the room with near inhuman speed, coming to a halt inches from the captive's face. He grabbed a fistful of the captive's hair, matted and dark with sweat and blood, and yanked the head up into the slim light. Streams of blood danced down the handsome young man's cheeks, evidence of the intense gash he bore on the side of his brow. Faint moonlight caught within beautiful, piercing blue eyes that looked to meet his captor's gaze. Under the hood of the shadowy cloak, he found a glowing, crimson glamour instead. Like two burning portals into a dark, lost soul, it haunted the boy to stare into the Dark One's scarlet eyes. But he could not break away. A new sense of horror dawned upon the captive, as he realized this indeed was someone he once knew. But the agony and terror of the torture clouded his head as he struggled for the memories he needed. "Do not tell me what I can and cannot do." The Dark One seethed the threat between his teeth, still gripping the young man's head by his locks. "I will have the staff," he chided, "and no one will stop me. One way or another, you will tell me everything you know." Defiance set into the captive's jaw at the challenge. Resignation gave him courage, despite every bone in his body feeling like it could shatter from the mechanism to which he was chained. "I know nothing." The Dark One gritted his teeth, recognizing the resolve he had accidentally created as he dropped the boy's head back with a heavy knock. Rage took him once more. "Then my only recourse will be to torment everyone you love instead." "No," the prisoner pleaded. "I said I do not know." The Dark One cackled darkly, the sound splintering off the cavern walls. "I don't understand." The captive trailed hopelessly, under the tightening hold of the torturers. Something in the earnest admission gnawed at the Dark One's ego, cutting him short in his wicked tirade. Of course you don't. Of course you don't understand what is happening. The Dark One replied, his condescending voice a little less sinister. A sheltered life did not exactly serve you well now, did it? He begrudgingly reminisced, his fingers setting into a slow thrum against one another as he paced. Because Father never let you down. Father was your hero, but Father also did everything for you, did he not? Always there to cover a multitude of sins and shortcomings. He made sure of it. I remember all too well. The distance in his voice grew as he seemed to lose himself in his thoughts. Though being born with your lineage had its advantages, didn't it? The throngs of people, shouting and chanting your name, while I merely existed in your shadow. Glory upon shining glory they lavished you, even when I surpassed you in so many ways. The Dark One's tone danced along the brink of insanity. But you just couldn't be satisfied with the pacified and perfect life set before you. You always wanted more, and I watched your greedy hunger come alive as you made me your stepping stone, and I forced a smile for the world, despite knowing that you were never deserving of your power, of your title. He sneered, what I could have done with your life if it were mine. I'm sure you now remember the day I speak of, the day everything failed. The Dark One mused, as if he was only talking with himself, memories of another life consuming him. I tried to bargain with you, but anyone would have done as you had. It was, after all, treason. Honestly, what could I have offered you? You already held everything you could have ever wanted, and I should have been more careful on my part. He mumbled absently. The Dark One's scarlet gaze flickered back to the prisoner whose mouth had fallen agape, eyes wide with terrible realization. His captive had finally connected the dots. The Dark One smirked to himself. Enough of memory lane, he nonchalantly finished, moving closer to the boy once more. Now, I'm going to ask you again, he proposed evenly, his next words concise and clear. Where is the staff? I did always want more. The boy ignored the question as he mustered all the might he had to raise himself up against his restraints. His voice no longer wavered, and despite feeling his own hot blood sliding down his marred back, a renewed line of power began to course through his body. I am the standard set against your kind, he declared. You still have the will to challenge me? The Dark One warned. The young man then proclaimed with all the strength he had left in his lungs, my power was never yours to begin with. It cannot be taken. I know who you are, and I do not fear you. He cried out in a voice belonging to that of a righteous God, agony searing in his bones. The world suddenly rumbled and quaked, as if in response to the bold declaration. Chunks of stone careened to the ground, and the phantom whispers flared fearfully in the tongue of the dead. The Dark One surged across the room, driving his fist into the captive's stomach, forcing out the air from the boy's lungs with a terrible groan. He then flicked his wrist and motioned for the torturers to continue. The captive inhaled sharply. Terror his limbs would finally be torn from his body as a fresh wave of fiery anguish coursed through the crackling joints. The shaking of the world built into a rocking crescendo as part of the cavern's roof and outer wall caved in. The moon's full light and a gust of cold air flooded into the dungeon grotto from the new aperture. The Dark One's cloak of shadows hissed as it lost opacity in the silvery, celestial stream. The hood fell back about his broad shoulders, revealing his true form. He was a young man himself, albeit a few years older than his prisoner. Sleek, yet jet hair swept back from his forehead, grazing his shoulders as he stood tall in lavish robes of ebony and silver that ran to the ground. A faint, green light emanated from the distinctly curved dagger he carried sheathed on his left side. The crimson glow in his gaze intensified as a twisting grin, most malevolent in nature, held fast to his lips, contorting his deceptively attractive face. With immense satisfaction, the Dark One finally raised his hand toward the torturers, signaling them to relent. He needed to ensure that the boy stayed alive. "Release him," he ordered. The slaves obeyed their master and unshackled the young man. The captive fell to the floor violently with a moan, still shaking through his tears. The Dark One came nearer, the moon shining off his raven hair, and knelt down on one knee. His long fingers laced into the young man's soaked locks once more, and he brought up his head to whisper into his ear, "No one can hear you. No one will come to save you. You can't even save yourself." His lilting cadence calm, yet sinister. "You are mine, and never will you see any light outside of this realm again. You belong to me." The Dark One dropped the head, letting it hit the stone-cold ground. The captive gave no response. "I think our little prince needs a break," he said to his torturers. "Clean him up to heal. Legends aside, his kind has their limits." The Desdom torturers hissed lowly in obedience. The Dark One turned to glide out the door, his cape of shadows regaining opacity as he stepped deeper into the darkness. They will come looking for me," the prisoner weakly croaked. The Dark One halted, now completely in the shadow of the grotto. His voice was ice. "No, they won't." The Desdom guards on the other side of the dungeon's door tumbled the heavy locks. The solid iron gate slowly swung open, and the Dark One walked through. The torturers picked up the gravely wounded prince and moved him to a pile of dark straw on the edge of the cavern, avoiding the new piles of rubble and rock that had been loose from the quake. An iron chain clicked darkly against the stones as they shacked his wrists. The faint whispers of the settling shadows, the soft crackling of straw beneath him, the shuffling footsteps of the withdrawing minions. Such a stark contrast from his own screams that had roared in his ears a few moments before. The torturers paced out the door, and it shut behind them with a brazen clang, sending chills of hopeless despair up the captive's back. With a sense of finality, the iron locks rolled back into place, and everything was still. The moonlight poured through the break in the thick clouds, through the new aperture of the ceiling, and onto his broken body. Straw clung to the blood that slicked his back, his arms. He realized his bones were going to set wrong. They would have to be broken again. He had accumulated and healed from a substantial number of injuries in his time, but this pain was beyond any limit he had ever known. He forced himself to open his eyes and gazed into the moon, the silvery light blinding him. All he knew was that if he could stare into the moon, then he could make it. The girl he loved was still out there. "I will hold on for her. I will leave this place. I will stop him. I must protect them all. I must." The celestial body started to blur. Everything began to swirl and float. All went black. Chapter 1. The brilliance of dawn peeked into the rustic cottage room, through the billowing gossamer curtains, superseding the rain of night. The first rays revealed the dust motes, highlighting their dances amongst the brimming cedar bookshelves that lined the teal and gray stone walls. The light grew to touch the volumes and the trinkets the shelves held, all of them belonging to various origins and creeds and realms, revealing their well-worn spines and well-handled exteriors. The golden light strengthened, stretched, and cast its warmth across the haphazard odds and ends strewn about the wooden floor. Stacks of books, pages of parchment scribbled, and doodled upon, a pale chemise, a few crumpled skirts, a jacquard bodice and ribbons, a sheathed dagger, stockings, and a pair of boots. The sun reclaimed this land in totality, finally touching the artfully weathered oak dresser on the farthest wall, and rebounded back into the room from the large oval mirror of which it held. Within this bedroom, upon a carved four-post bed, Adela Everhart slumbered. A duvet and several mismatched blankets bunched around her, halfway covering her body, partially sliding off her bed frame. She rested upon her stomach, and with an arm over the side of the mattress, the sleeve of her nightgown grazed the floor. Her long chestnut locks blazed golden auburn wherever they caught the rays of sun, and they splayed about her head in a cascade of tousled tangles. The growing dawn illuminated her face, seeming to set it aglow from within, yet her mouth hung comically slack. Indeed, she was beautiful in the eyes of many who knew her. However, Adela wholly believed the generalized sentiment of beauty sleep could hardly be applied regarding her own slumber. Adela stirred in the light of the new day as her strange dreams began to swirl into a jumble of indescribable colors, thoughts, and feelings. Magical notes sounded through the air from the iridescent crystal sphere on her willow bark nightstand. Piercing, unmistakable, the melody trilled harmonious chimes, loudly demanding attention. Ah! Adela inhaled with a start. Ah! Adela inhaled with a start as she tumbled out of bed, sheets falling behind her. She mumbled sleepily to herself, rubbing her eyes, clamoring to grab her crystal ball. She snatched the magical piece and rolled it about in her hands, silencing its pealing cries. She yawned and studied the time for a moment. The alarm went off an hour too late. What the spell? Her thoughts panicked. I forgot to set the early alarm on this thing. She tossed the glowing ball into her sheets and blurred about her room, careful of the miscellaneous articles scattered about her floor. She grabbed the nearest bodice and skirt she could find, grateful that they already matched in their dusty blue and creamy hues, along with a clean chemise hanging in her mahogany wardrobe. Adela cast off her nightgown and hastily laced herself into her boots and clothes, and then reached for the hairbrush on the edge of her oak dresser. She looked into the mirror and watched herself quickly flick the bristles through the impossibly long strands, starting at the tips and working up to her roots in a flash. Around the carved borders of the looking glass were wedged a few parchment renderings of her family and friends, memories that meant the world to Adela. Her gaze settled upon one particularly painful image that she had not the heart to pull down. She looked away before the thought could settle into her lungs and still the air as she finished sorting her hair. She then retrieved her crystal from the tangle of sheets and paused for a moment. She wanted to make the bed, but realizing there was no time, she instead turned to rush into the modest washroom to brush her teeth. Her crystal started to chime wildly again. Oh, Adela gurgled, looking into the magical sphere, her foamy toothbrush hanging out of the corner of her mouth. A radiant, deep olive face framed with waves of ebony hair appeared in the glowing orb. Adela Redding, where are you? We're at Drew's palace waiting right now. Wait, are you brushing your teeth? You're still at home? Adela spit into the basin and wiped her mouth. I'm so sorry, Rain. I was just about to scrawl you back. I got your message about our early study session, but I was so busy that I forgot to set my alarm last night. She finished washing up and made for the stairs. Oh, dear. Raina moaned under her breath. Yeah, I know, Adela agreed as she dashed around the house to gather the rest of her things. Dalla. Raina chided her name again. Did you fall asleep studying again? Her bright amethyst eyes queried. Adela trailed off. You were studying for the Ag and Trade midterms, right? It's crucial for the apprenticeship tests. You told me yourself this year that you weren't sure that you want to continue on with the smithy. Raina persisted. her face magnifying larger within Adela's orb, as if she was pressing in for a closer look. "Of course, and I told you yesterday I was going to pull a late-nighter because of my schedule," Adela explained, awkwardly omitting the truth in the conversation. Despite being too exhausted to open a single textbook the previous evening after her obligations, sleep still cruelly eluded Adela. She found herself staring yet again into the reaches of the night sky beyond her window until the moon had long faded away. "Always the sleep deprivation with you," Raina sighed. "It's not so bad, Rain." Adela smiled wryly. "I'm still getting high marks at least." "Yes, and you're doing too much." Her best friend smiled sadly in return. Raina was too intuitive, and usually Adela loved that about her. But Adela had also made the choice to keep her grief to herself as much as possible. To keep so busy that it would bury itself away until it no longer existed. Even if that day would never come, she had to try. "Let's game plan later today then, okay?" Raina proposed. "Get a better schedule going for our study days." "All right, I'll just meet you guys at school then." "Perfect. If you get there in time, you might be able to do some last-minute quizzing with us in the quad before first bell." Raina winked as she put a juice straw in her mouth and took a quick sip. "Though I'm pretty sure we're beyond hopeless at this point," she added with a short laugh, looking back to Schmitty behind her. "Hey!" he voiced a weak protest, frowning in the background. "Don't sell yourself short, Ran," Adela encouraged. "You guys are going to do great today." "Uh-huh," Raina voiced, a cynical note lacing through the playful sound. "Morning, Adela." A mop of wavy copper hair and hazel eyes popped into Adela's crystal from behind Raina's shoulder. "Hey, Schmidt," Adela responded. "I'll see you guys at school. I'm walking out the door as we speak. See you in a spell, Del. Ride safe." "You too, Rain." Adela touched the iridescent ball with her finger, and it made a delicate tinkling sound. The faces faded and disappeared into the crystal's glittery, clouded depths. She gave a tight squeeze to the enchanted orb in her palm, and it rescinded down to its compact form, allowing her to slip it into a side pocket on her soft leather book bag. "Bye, Mom. I'll see you later," Adela quickly called out through the open shutters of the sitting room window to the front garden. "I love you." "Love you too, honey," her mother echoed a reply, mostly obscured by her giant sun hat and the rose bushes she pruned. Adela turned back and slung her satchel around her body, hooked the clasp of a deep blue riding cape around her neck, and raced out the back door. She streaked past their water well, through the back garden path, unlatched the gate on the arched stone entry, then bounded across the open field of wheat and down the main road to the blacksmith hall at the end of their property. She flung herself through the threshold of the barn's giant, open doors on the other end of the workshop. "Morning, Dad! Bye, Dad!" She shouted the words so fast that they were almost a slur when they reached her father's ears across the hall. She rushed to the stable and greeted her beautiful caramel Andalusian, Anisha, only to see that her saddle was already prepped and ready for the ride. "Good morning, Princess," her father's voice called from his work on the other side of the smithy. The brash clang of a hammer hitting hot steel held a steady rhythm. Adela's chest tightened to see that her father had thought of her today, buying her time and preparing her horse. "Thank you, Dad," she called out as she hopped up into the saddle in one lithe movement, secretly proud of how far she had come in her skill as a rider over the last few years. "Hurry, Della," he called out through the hammer falls. "Let's go." Adela breathed with a nudge forward. Anisha bolted from the stable like lightning, leaving behind a trail of swirling dust. The morning air whisked past Adela's cheeks, crisp and cool and brisk. "Come on, Annie. Little more," she coaxed, and the horse picked up the pace. She could feel the pounding hooves in her heart, could hear the clean snaps of her cape fluttering behind. Adela felt free, flying in the sunlight of the new day, the wind whipping through her long, golden chestnut hair. The sky blossomed into a bright cerulean, and the forest, grain fields, orchards, and vineyards blurred past in their early autumn's tide hues. The world smelled faintly of leaves and smoke, of wine and earth, of apples, dew, and pine. Her cheeks numbed with the fading chill. Riding her horse like this was one of the only times that Adela still felt somewhat alive. Somewhat. But far too quickly did her beloved back roads give way to the first signs of the township, and as Adela passed through the entry post, Northbrook Valley, the last of the quiet and beautiful scenic dissolved, she entered reality with a stoic resignation as the hustle and bustle of the town accosted her senses. The streets were always an ordeal to navigate at this hour. People shouted down from the tall windows of generational townhomes, while shopkeepers dusted the steps to their thatched roof storefronts. Goods and foods and coin changed through eager hands. Horses and wagon wheels trotted and clattered upon cobblestone. Stands and carts with the gatherings of harvest showcased their wares, while carriage bells rang and rang and rang. The occasional "get on with it" was distinctly hollered. Adela sighed to herself. Just a few more roads to my school. I can do this. I will not be late.